right, I think the music dying down is my signal. Thank you and welcome to the Four Seasons Ballroom. If you're here for the Amway meeting, you're in the wrong room. Okay. Anyways, AI identifying methods to manage Apple Intelligence with Jamf Pro with our special speakers, Lee Cacioppo, oh, I did it wrong, and Matt Jerome. We are very excited for the presentation that they have today. We will have Q&A at the end. If you need anything, let us know. I'm Kristen Parker, your room host, but we're really glad you're here. Guys, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Our session is AI identifying methods to manage Apple Intelligence with Jamf Pro. My name is Lee Cacioppo, and I am a senior professional services engineer at Jamf. My job is teaching the instructor-led training courses. So if you take a 200, 270, 300, 370, or 400 class, there's a chance that I'll be your instructor. I can also be found on the Mac admin Slack at LJ Cacioppo.
And I am Matt Jerome, senior engineer for desktops at Fanatics, where we manage about 1,400 Macs around the globe. I am not an instructor in any way, but you can find me at Matt Jerome on the Mac admin Slack.
First, we're going to start off by talking about what is Apple Intelligence. Apple's developer documentation defines Apple Intelligence as the personal intelligence system that puts powerful generative models right at the core of your iPhone, iPad, Mac, Apple Vision Pro, and Apple Watch, with incredible new features to help people communicate and work better. But what does that mean to us? When we think about Apple Intelligence, we probably think about the individual feature set. We'd think about things like audio recording summaries, integrations with LLMs like ChatGPT, writing tools, cleaning up photos, things like Image Playground or Genmoji, summarizing messages, image wand, and private cloud compute. The list goes on, but not every organization may want all of these features implemented. And we're here to talk to you today about how you can manage access to those features.
So we have private cloud compute, and what is private cloud compute? I warn you, I'm gonna read a lot because Apple's documentation on this is very dense. So I've done my best to go through each of these points and summarize them. This was done a few months ago, so things may have changed. I would advise you to double check Apple's documentation, and the URL is at the bottom for that. Private cloud compute, when the request is too much for the local machine, so when you can't do it on your Mac, it uses Apple's cloud servers to process the request, and there's 5 protections that helps ensure the data is private. Apple isn't always the clearest, like I said, but we're going to do the best we can with what Apple provides. We have stateless computation on personal user data. If you could click it. Data only used on that request, never available to other users, Apple staff, and data is not retained after it's complete. So when you submit a request, only you have access to it for that specific period of time. Apple can't access it. We have enforceable guarantees where no external components outside of Apple infrastructure can access the data. So you need to be within Apple's purview to access that data. There is no privileged runtime access. No privileged access by Apple at any time, so Apple can't really access it, including to resolve an outage or an issue. So Apple Intelligence is having a problem, they can't access your request to help solve the problem. And there's no adjusting a request when more processing power is needed, such as loading software. So they don't change how much power a user has. We have non-targetability. An attacker should not be able to compromise personal data that belongs to specific people. Targeted private cloud compute users without attempting a broad compromise of the entire system. So in order for an attacker to get in, they have to get to the entire system. An individual cannot be targeted. And we have verifiable transparency. Security researchers must be able to verify the security and privacy guarantees of private cloud compute, and they must be able to verify that the software that's running in a PCC environment is the same as the software they're inspecting when they verify the guarantees. In other words, security researchers must be able to verify all of these protections. So what do we need? And a fun fact, because this isn't a talk on AI, Apple Intelligence, or artificial intelligence, these images were generated by Microsoft Copilot. If you like them, I take 100% of the credit. If you don't, I blame Microsoft. We have some essential people to really get Apple Intelligence into your organization. We have our IT service desk, information security, your Jamf admin, all of you, and technology leadership. These are essential people to get this through, because this isn't just a technological project. It's a legal project, a privacy project, and user experience. And I encourage you to view these people as allies versus adversaries, because if you work together, it's much easier than working against each other. Everyone has the same goal of keeping your environment secure. And it just makes everything work smoother. Just working together is just a lot easier than working against each other. There's a lot of different ways to manage Apple Intelligence. We're going to go through a couple, and some of them depend on Mac versus mobile. Mobile device really meaning anything that's not a Mac. A note that when we made this, macOS 26 was not released, so some information might be slightly out of date. We suggest reviewing the documentation from Jamf and Apple before implementing anything, and as always, use your sandbox. If you are a cloud customer and don't have a sandbox, go talk to your rep.
Apple has provided a variety of keys to manage Apple Intelligence features, starting in Sequoia. With the dot releases in Sequoia, newer restrictions have been added incrementally. As you can see from the chart, there is a minimum operating system requirement for each of these restriction keys. You want to make sure that when you're planning out how you'll manage them, you will want to reference what operating systems the restrictions you want to use actually apply to. If you deploy a restriction before it existed in macOS, it does not retroactively apply after an operating system update. So typically, you'll want to make sure that you are targeting computers on that operating system or later to ensure that the key is successfully used. We're going to see different restrictions here for things like Genmoji, writing tools, ChatGPT. This is not every setting that exists in Apple Intelligence, but these are the keys that we've been provided by Apple. In addition to this, there's also the math settings, declarative device management option in Blueprints. As for iOS, we have a similar looking set of keys available to us. These all apply, both macOS and iOS, to the preference domain of com.apple.applicationaccess. You'll notice a lot of overlap here between the keys that existed for macOS and the ones that exist for iOS and iPadOS. However, there are some restrictions that apply to mobile devices that did not exist for macOS, including things like image wand, personalized handwriting results, and visual intelligence summary. Again, just like the list for macOS, we have the operating system requirements for what restriction keys apply to which versions of those operating systems. All of this information is available in the developer page, so we recommend you take a look at Apple's developer documentation for full compatibility information.
So we advise scoping things based on major OS versions. So macOS 14, macOS 15, macOS 16. There are a lot of changes from OS to OS, or at least that's how it feels when I do it. It also forces you to review all of your settings once a year, and validate them. Make sure what you're deploying really still needs to be deployed. There is a brute force method. Excuse me. There is a brute force method to blocking Apple Intelligence. You can use the restricted software payload. The problem with that is it does give you some errors. It's clunky and a bit ugly, but it does get the job done if you need to put just an immediate hold on Apple Intelligence. If you do that, this is what you'll see. When you go to System Settings and the Siri pane, you'll get that you're not allowed to use it. Just like here, you can customize the message in the OK box, but you will get the settings error. You can also use blueprints, configuration profiles. There's a pre-stage enrollment setting, as well as some really valuable extension attributes that can help you manage your Jamf Pro deployment. I'm sorry, Apple Intelligence deployment in Jamf Pro.
First, we're going to talk about blueprints and the steps to create a blueprint. So we navigate into the blueprints portion of the sidebar, and then choose the Create in the upper right to create a new blueprint. Here, we can name our blueprint given the purpose and provide a description. Again, we can then press the Create button. Here is where we can customize the contents of our blueprint. We can scroll down to the restrictions portion, and we can search by name for the item that we were looking for if we know that information. Here, I'm looking specifically for Apple Intelligence. We can see what versions of macOS and iOS are supported with this key, because blueprints can apply to both macOS and mobile devices. Keeping in mind what we spoke about earlier regarding smart group considerations, we'll want to make sure that this blueprint is deployed to macOS 15.2 or later and iOS 18.2 or later to ensure compatibility. In addition, there is an alternative method you can use to search for those keys related to Apple Intelligence. Maybe you don't know the name of the key that you want to enforce. In the upper right corner, you can filter, and there are tag options of what you can filter by. You can filter specifically for those keys related to Apple Intelligence. This will only show you any of the Apple Intelligence related items, and then you can pick and choose the functionality from that filtered list. Once we're done adding the items we would like to include in our blueprint, we can open up the scope to determine which sets of devices we're going to deploy this to. Since blueprints can apply to both computers and mobile devices, when we search smart groups, we find both the computer smart groups and the mobile device smart groups. Here, I searched for the words "or later," knowing that I had smart groups that existed for both types of devices containing that string of text, and I can select both the iOS 18.2 or later and macOS 15.2 or later smart groups. Once those groups are added, we can press the Deploy button at the top to begin that deployment. We'll receive a notification that the deployment has started, and we'll also see a status of that deployment, showing us an aggregate number of how many are already accepted that deployment, how many are pending, and how many have failed. To give you an idea of what this would look like on the end user device, with that ChatGPT integration, if we have the restriction not enforced, you can see that a user could go into their settings and click on the option to integrate with something like ChatGPT. By applying that blueprint, it grays out that option, not allowing the user, and has a message stating ChatGPT integration features have been turned off for the iPad. Although the messaging seems to align more with what would exist if Apple parental controls had been deployed. The same functionality exists on the Mac. Here we can see what the interface would look like with it allowed, where a user can again integrate with ChatGPT. But if we deploy that blueprint and restrict that option, again, the option is grayed out, not allowing the user to proceed. And it is defined as off with a message stating ChatGPT integration features have been restricted on the Mac.
And excuse me, like we said, you can also use a configuration profile. And for this config, we are using com.apple.applicationaccess. I have become a fan of using copy-paste into your profiles because when you use the checkboxes, it's either on or off. There's really no do nothing, and that's where blueprints come into play. And the manual copy-paste gives you the opportunity to be really explicit and purposeful, or use blueprints if your org is set up with Jamf SSO. There are schemas available for this. If you do make a configuration profile, I suggest using something like low profile to detect if the settings you just deployed in that new profile are overlapping or duplicates of another profile you have. Use a test machine for this. Using this app low profile does make things a lot easier and just bypasses a lot of potential problems. Like I said, it can be done with the restrictions payload, but it gets tricky because, like I said, things are either on or off. There's no do nothing. That's why blueprints are so powerful. But these are the checkboxes to either allow or not allow Apple Intelligence, and they're all there. You just click the box and hit save. And just like we did before, you click add for the scope and put in the correct groups that you want. And as a reminder, if a key has a minimum OS, you can't enable it in a low OS that's lower. So if it requires 15.2, you can't scope it to something, say 15.0 and lower. It just creates a mess. I recommend making separate profiles for each key that has a specific OS requirement. And here's a quick demo of what it looks like to restrict or allow iPhone mirroring on the Mac. This is what you'll see when iPhone mirroring is restricted. And you see a pop-up that just says it's restricted. And a demo of the writing tools. You can see that there's an icon in the notes that allow writing tools. And now it is gone.
On the iOS side of restrictions, the configuration profile is factored out. So it does only include the keys that we choose, like we saw with blueprints, but unlike we saw with macOS. Once we start a new configuration profile, we can choose the built-in restrictions payload. In case you're not using blueprints yet, you can use this instead and choose the functionality tab to see the Apple Intelligence related items. We can scroll through the restrictions options here in Jamf Pro. As we scroll through, we see a section of Apple Intelligence related features labeled as such. Each restriction key has the listed requirements for that key to apply, operating system compatibility, and if supervision is required. Looking again at the external intelligence integrations restriction again, we can see it applies to iOS 18.2 or later on supervised mobile devices, and we can choose to restrict that key. Once we have made our selections, we can navigate to the Scope tab and choose which devices to target. On the Scope tab, we can choose to add mobile device groups to the targets. And again, scope this out specifically to our iOS 18.2 or later smart group. I could have also included a supervised criteria in that smart group, as the key we are working with here only applies if the mobile device is supervised, but I did just use the same one that I had in my demo for blueprints. Again, adding that smart group to our scope. On the user devices, to show you what the impact would be, if we open up an application like Image Playground. With it allowed, we're allowed to use the application, like we saw before you deployed a blueprint. If we restrict that functionality, we'll see error messages depending on what functionality we try to use. For example, things like certain capabilities are unavailable at this time. Some features may appear to be unavailable to user, and they inform the users that those features are not available once the feature tries to utilize the functionality, and others just have the functionality disappear from the user interface. For example, with writing tools, before the restrictions deployed, we can see writing tools as an option in the contextual menu when I tap on the screen. But if we push out our restriction configuration profile here, it just disappears from that contextual menu as if it never existed. So depending on the item you're working with, sometimes it may prompt the user and they may see that error, and other times it may look to them as if it never existed to begin with.
Depending on if you want it enabled or disabled, here's a little video to show the prompt during pre-stage enrollment. And this is available in your pre-stage enrollment settings, whether to show this or not. This is the screen you'll see that will be skipped if you want during macOS setup in the pre-stage. If you leave that checkbox blank, you will see this. If you check it, you will not.
On the iOS side, we also have the option to skip setup items, and we can tell it to skip the Apple Intelligence related item during Setup Assistant. So as the user is just starting to set up their device, we don't want them to be prompted with enabling Apple Intelligence related features. This is how we can bypass that prompt from occurring.
This is the screen in iOS that will be skipped, like Lee mentioned, during Setup Assistant. It looks very similar to the macOS, just with the iOS flavor.
What we just spoke about was the options in pre-stage enrollments, if you wanted to skip it when the device is first being set up. However, users may also be prompted to enable Apple Intelligence after an operating system upgrade. For that, we can actually deploy a configuration profile containing a skip setup items key that contains an array of strings of which items we want skipped. This can ensure that if we're upgrading from macOS Sequoia to macOS Tahoe, that we don't see the setup item for Apple Intelligence during that upgrade process. So for macOS, we can do this by creating a custom configuration profile containing a property list looking like what we have here on screen. My property list contains the one key skip setup items with an array containing the screens that I want skipped, in this case, intelligence. We can take that property list and paste it into an application and custom settings payload in Jamf Pro and deploy this with the appropriate managed domain. It is com.apple.setupassistant.managed as the preference domain we are enforcing that key for. If we choose to implement this, this screen would be the one that's skipped during that upgrade process. It looks very similar to what you would see in normal Setup Assistant. It's just slightly different because it's the one they would see during the upgrade process instead. For iOS, the process is even easier, as we have a payload in mobile device configuration profiles called skip setup items. So we just have a checkmark box that we can use to implement that feature. On iOS, again, although this screen looks similar to the one that occurs during Setup Assistant, this is the one that would happen during an upgrade from iOS 18 to iOS 26.
There are some checks if you have not deployed any protection to see if someone has logged in with a ChatGPT account, for instance, and we have an extension attribute here. It's a good way to involve leadership and security on communications to present a unified front on policies. In most cases, as IT, we are not the policy makers. We are the policy enforcers. So it's just a good way to have a check with some data behind you to help make those policies with your team. And again, this is the whole property list on the computer and what it looks like and where that attribute is pulling from to see if ChatGPT was enabled. That info that the EA is getting comes from the user library and in the com.apple.siri.generative assistant settings.plist.
If you're looking for additional information on the management of Apple Intelligence, we wanted to provide a few links. The QR code on this slide goes to a GitHub repository that contains all of these links and a PDF version of our keynote slides. A few of the specific resources that we wanted to highlight here include Apple's documentation, things like the Apple Platform Deployment Guide, Private Cloud Compute Security Guide, and Apple's blog on private cloud compute. As for community blogs, 3 individuals have posted a whole lot of information regarding Apple Intelligence that you can use as an additional resource. So a special thank you to Bob Gendler, Rich Troughton, and Dr. Emily Kay. So big thank you to all of them and all of the information that they provide to the community. Thank you all for your time, and let us know if you have any questions.
From just the number of people taking pictures of your slides, great job. All right, what questions do we have?
Hey guys, over here. Love the presentation, very informative. Hoping to put it to good use when I get back on the East Coast. Question about any dependencies about Apple Intelligence. Is it dependent on Siri being enabled in addition to being able to access Apple Intelligence? So if you block Siri, that's not going to stop someone from enabling and using AI.
Do you want to take it away?
I can't remember. I think they're codependent.
The payload in system settings is codependent, so if you use something like the restricted software process that Matt showed, you're blocking that entire pane from being accessed by the user.
So the entire AI pane from the system settings would be blocked effectively?
If you deploy that restricted software, you're blocking that entire pane where that's where you saw the error message if they tried to click on it. But if you're deploying the individual restriction items with the preference keys,
That's what we're doing.
That would not restrict that pane from being logged into, per se. Only preventing them from doing that would be if you blocked the entire pane via restricted software or the like.
Okay.
And that's because the Siri turn on and the Apple Intelligence turn on are in the same pane.
Yes.
In system settings.
Got it. Thank you.
Two questions. One, sorry, I think you had mentioned earlier, but if we set a restriction that happens to not apply to the existing OS, we have to exclude it, right? So that it would only apply if it's already on that version. Otherwise, that profile would have to be reapplied on it, right?
Correct. So if you have like 15.0 or 18.0, depending on your device, and a key didn't come out till 15.2, it will not see that the key restriction is there when it gets upgraded to 15.2. You will need a different profile with that key applied to 15.2 or later.
Yeah, or reapplying the profile like you said. It wouldn't prevent the profile from deploying, but it's basically just ignoring the key since it doesn't understand it yet because it doesn't exist yet.
And this applies on iPhone and iOS and iPadOS too, right?
Correct. That does apply to macOS, iOS, and iPadOS.
And just one more question. Is there any preference, like which way Like if you use Blueprint or config profile to push something?
I think so. If I had like the magic wand, we would all be able to use blueprints despite what our organization is using. I think blueprints is the right way to go because you can have the enforce, or don't do anything. You can't have the don't do anything with config profiles, at least using the restrictions GUI payload.
To add on to that, I agree, blueprints would be the ideal method here, but understanding that not everyone in this room may be able to use blueprints, we wanted to highlight both options. With the built-in configuration profiles, restrictions payload for macOS, since it's not factored out, you risk accidentally deploying multiple configuration profiles containing conflicting keys, one with a setting allowed and one with a setting not allowed. And when you have the same key enforced different ways, the resulting behavior is undefined. One of those will take precedence, but I can't give you an absolute guarantee which one.
And just to, again, go off, the app low profile, if you put all your settings on a test machine and install the app called low profile, it will tell you where you have duplicates in your profiles to help you suss those out.
Not a question, just a comment. Bob Gendler has a third blog, which he goes over how you can determine what things have gone to private cloud compute and what is handled locally on device. So it's still the same bobberito.medium.com domain.
Yeah, I think he released that after we submitted our final version of the slides.
I'll go ahead and update the GitHub repo after this session to also include that link. Thank you.
Sorry if I missed this, but if someone's already signed up and set up AI in there, does this unassociate them from that, or is that still set up?
So if you're talking about the individual restriction keys, that would restrict just the individual functionality of those certain items, even if they're logged in. If you're talking about the restricted software pane, it prevents them from accessing the pane, but it wouldn't log them out. Okay. So that's also a bit of a risk, but where you might want to use something like the extension attribute reporting from Dr. K of like, is this person already logged in with a ChatGPT integration? Might be something to look at before you deploy a restriction profile, making it where people can't access that pane anymore.
Yeah.
And that's also when using data like that with your IT leadership and your security team turns those teams, which sometimes we get into an adversarial relationship with, really into allies and a solid team to get this deployed.
So I'm sorry if this is outside of the scope of the conversation, but I'm wondering about the reasons as to why I would want to implement these restrictions, because nobody's actually asking me to do it. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the risks of leaving AI unchecked in my environment.
I think it's going to vary per organization. So if you leave the external ChatGPT integrations enabled, for instance, somebody has a ChatGPT account and they put that, you do run the risk of ChatGPT training on your organization's data. Whereas if you disable that, you mitigate that risk. So it's all about what your privacy and legal and security teams would they view as an acceptable risk. We've gotten the question about this, what's the best practice for this? And I always say it's not the best practice, blanket statement, it's what's best for your organization. Because my needs might be different than your needs depending on, do you have SOC 2 compliance? Do you have HIPAA compliance? So it really is going to depend on what your organization needs.
Great question. Any others?
For the third-party integration piece, is that just an on or off, or can I define what I want to approve and what not? Like maybe I don't want ChatGPT, but I do want Copilot or something like that, for example.
There are two keys related to those allowed external integrations. There's one that's just allowed external integrations. Basically, are you allowing something like ChatGPT integration or are you not? The second key is allowed external integrations workspace IDs, where you can specify workspace IDs that you do want allowed.
All right, we've got time. Anybody have any other questions?
Yeah, how about the skip setup items? Can you put it up and lay it in ambush, so to speak, or does it have to be linked to a software update profile?
You can have that running independently. You can push that configuration profile on its own, and then when that device performs a software update, it's basically just told to ignore showing that screen to the user.
And just one comment to the one that didn't know how or why to use. We did use it for disabling math nodes on the iPad when that got the calculator. So it helps with exams and whatnot.
Any more? All right, thank you both so much for the presentation. How can people find you?
We'll both be around JNUC all week. As I said before, I can be found at LJ Cacioppo on the Mac Admin Slack.
And at Matt Jerome on the Mac Admin Slack. I'll be around with everyone until Thursday.
Also, please fill out your surveys at the end of for each session that you attend. There's a survey link. We appreciate all your feedback. Enjoy the rest of your time here. Thanks so much for being here.